The most successful heist in history wasn't pulled off with guns or masks, it was pulled off with words. In 1910, 7 men gathered on a private island to design a system that would control your money forever. But their genius wasn't in what they built, it was in what they called it. They created a private bank and called it federal. They created a debt machine and called it a reserve. They created a cartel and called it a system. And they did it so well that over a century later, most Americans still think the Federal Reserve is part of the government. It isn't. It never was. And understanding the language trick they used is the key to understanding why you're working harder than your grandparents while falling further behind. This isn't another video about Jekyll Island. You've probably heard that story. 7 bankers, a secret train, a private island, a bill drafted in hiding. What you haven't heard is how they got away with it. How they convinced a nation that hated central banks to accept one. How they took an idea Americans had rejected twice before and repackaged it so brilliantly that Congress passed it without even understanding what they were voting for. The Federal Reserve Act wasn't just a financial document. It was a masterpiece of propaganda. And the techniques they used in 1910 are still being used on you today. Let's start with the problem they faced. By 1910, Americans had killed 2 central banks. Andrew Jackson destroyed the second bank of the United States in the 1830s and declared that if the people ever understood the banking system, there would be revolution before morning. For nearly 80 years, no politician dared propose another one. The words central bank were poison. Any bill with those words would be dead before it reached the floor. So the bankers needed a new vocabulary. They needed to describe a central bank without ever using those words. They needed to make the public think they were getting the opposite of what they were actually getting. The men on Jekyll Island weren't inventing anything new. They were copying a template that had worked brilliantly for over 200 years. The Bank of England, established in 1694, was the original model. A group of wealthy merchants offered to lend King William III money to fight his war against France. In exchange, they received the right to issue banknotes and collect interest on the national debt. The Bank of England wasn't created to serve the public. It was created to fund wars and enrich its private shareholders. It was a machine that converted government debt into private profit. Paul Warburg, the German banker who served as the intellectual architect on Jekyll Island, had studied this system obsessively. He understood how the Bank of England had financed the British Empire, how the Reichsbank had funded German military expansion, how the Banque de France had paid for Napoleon's wars. These central banks weren't neutral public institutions. They were engines that fused government power with private banking profit. The government got unlimited credit. The bankers got permanent interest payments. The public got inflation and taxes to service the debt. Everyone won except the citizens. Warburg wanted to bring this European model to America, but he faced a uniquely American obstacle. Europeans had accepted central banks for centuries. Americans had fought a revolution partly over monetary control. They remembered the colonial currencies that the British had manipulated. They remembered the hyperinflation of the continental dollar. They had rejected central banking twice. Warburg knew the only way to succeed was to make the American version look completely different from its European ancestors. Same machine, different paint job. The first trick was the name itself, Federal Reserve. Say those words slowly, federal. It sounds governmental, it sounds official, it sounds like it belongs to you, the citizen, the voter, but the Federal Reserve is not federal. It's a private corporation owned by its member banks. The word federal was chosen specifically because it would mislead. It's like calling a private prison the Department of Justice. The second word, reserve, implies that something is being held back, stored, protected. It suggests that your money is sitting in a vault somewhere, backed by gold or silver or something real. But there is no reserve. The system was designed from the beginning to create money from nothing. The reserve doesn't exist. It never existed. It was marketing. Then there's the word system, the Federal Reserve System, not the Federal Reserve Bank, not the Federal Reserve Corporation. System. It sounds distributed, decentralized, democratic. They created 12 regional banks spread across the country to complete the illusion. Look, they said, it's not controlled by New York. It's a system with branches everywhere, but the New York Fed runs the show. Always has. The regional banks are theater. The Federal Reserve System is as decentralized as a spider web, and the spider sits in Manhattan. If you're starting to see how they use language to hide control in plain sight, hit that like button. This isn't about gaming algorithms. It's about exposing a playbook that's been running for over a century. Every like pushes this in front of someone who still believes the Fed is a government agency. Now let me show you the next layer of the deception. The bankers on Jekyll Island faced a second problem. Senator Nelson Aldrich had drafted the original plan, and his name was political poison. Aldrich was the most visible face of the money trust. His daughter had married John D. Rockefeller Jr. Everyone knew he worked for the bankers. If the bill came from Aldrich, it would be attacked as a Wall Street power grab, which is exactly what it was. So they ran a play that would be used again and again throughout the 20th century. They created fake opposition. Here's how it worked. The bankers drafted one bill under Aldrich's name. Then they had their political allies in the Democratic Party draft a nearly identical bill under different names. The Aldrich Plan, the Glass-Owen Act, same architecture, same powers, different branding. Now they could stage a public fight. Republicans pushed the Aldrich Plan. Democrats attacked it as a banker bailout scheme. Then the Democrats proposed their alternative, the Federal Reserve Act, and sold it as reform. The public watched the theater and thought they were seeing democracy in action. They thought the Democrats had defeated the bankers. They had no idea both bills were written by the same people. This is the technique called controlled opposition. You create the enemy you're pretending to fight. You fund both sides of the debate. No matter who wins, you win. The bankers used this in 1913. They used it throughout the 20th century. They're still using it today. Every time you see a political fight where both sides lead to the same outcome, you're watching the Jekyll Island playbook. Watch closely next time there's a debate about financial regulation. One side will argue for more rules, the other side will argue for fewer rules. But notice what neither side ever questions: the existence of the Federal Reserve itself. The debate is always about how to manage the system, never about whether the system should exist. That's controlled opposition. The boundaries of acceptable debate are set in advance. The fundamental question is never asked. The same technique applies to political parties. Democrats and Republicans fight over tax rates and spending priorities. They never fight over who controls the money supply. They argue about how to distribute the crumbs while agreeing that the bakery belongs to the same owners. The Jekyll Island bankers didn't just capture the money system. They captured the language used to discuss it. They made certain questions unaskable. But the language manipulation went even deeper. They didn't just rename the central bank. They redefined what it would do. The Federal Reserve was sold to Congress as a solution to bank panics. The panic of 1907 had terrified the public. Banks collapsed. People lost their savings. The economy seized up. The bankers who caused the panic then offered themselves as the cure. We need a lender of last resort, they said, a safety net, an elastic currency that can expand during crises. Every one of those phrases was designed to sound protective. Elastic currency. It sounds flexible, responsive, like a safety feature. What it actually meant was the power to print unlimited money. Lender of last resort sounds like an emergency backstop. What it actually created was a permanent bailout mechanism for the banks that funded its creation. They were describing a predator using the language of a protector. And it worked. Congress passed the bill believing they were protecting Main Street from Wall Street. They were doing the opposite. They were handing Wall Street the keys to the money supply. The timing of the vote was itself a deception. December 22nd, 1913. 2 days before Christmas Eve, Congress wanted to go home. Half the members had already left for the holidays. The senators who might have opposed the bill, the populists from rural states who distrusted Eastern bankers, were already on trains heading back to their families. The vote was held with a skeleton Congress. Most of the representatives who voted yes had never read the bill. They trusted their party leaders who told them it was reform. Woodrow Wilson signed it on December 23rd. He would later reportedly tell friends that he had been deceived, that he had unwittingly ruined his country. But by then, the machine was built. Paul Warburg, the German banker who designed the system on Jekyll Island, was appointed to the first Federal Reserve Board. Benjamin Strong, J.P. Morgan's personal emissary from the secret meeting, became president of the New York Fed. The men who planned the heist moved directly into the building they had designed. Now here's what they don't tell you in the textbooks. The Federal Reserve Act was just the installation. The real heist came later. To understand the magnitude of what was stolen, you have to understand what existed before. Before 1913, America had what historians call the free banking era. Thousands of local banks issued their own currency. There was no central authority controlling the money supply. The system was chaotic. Yes, there were panics, there were failures, but there was also competition. No single institution could inflate the currency and force everyone to accept the devalued paper. If a bank printed too much, people stopped accepting their notes. The market disciplined bad behavior automatically. The Federal Reserve eliminated that discipline. It created a monopoly on money creation. And once you have a monopoly, you can do things that would be impossible in a competitive market. You can inflate the currency. You can fund wars without raising taxes. You can bail out your friends when their bets go bad. You can transfer wealth from workers to bankers through the invisible tax of rising prices. This is what the Fed has done since 1913. The dollar has lost over 97% of its purchasing power. A dollar in 1913 bought what requires over $30 today. That's not economic growth. That's theft. The money in your pocket melts while you sleep. The money in the banker's pocket is created fresh every morning. They get the new dollars first before prices rise. You get them last, after everything costs more. Economists call this the Cantillon effect. The Jekyll Island bankers called it the plan. The opposition that tried to stop this was systematically silenced. Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking Committee in the 1930s, stood on the floor of Congress and accused the Federal Reserve of deliberately causing the Great Depression. He said the Fed was a superstate controlled by international bankers who used their power to impoverish the American people. He brought formal charges against the Fed board. He called for impeachment. He named names. He read into the congressional record the exact mechanisms by which the Fed had contracted the money supply by 1/3. Collapsing prices, bankrupting farmers, and allowing the banks to scoop up assets for pennies on the dollar. McFadden didn't speak in vague accusations. He presented evidence. He traced the money flows. He showed how the same banks that caused the crash then profited from the fire sale that followed. His speeches fill dozens of pages in the congressional record. They are never assigned in economics classes. They are never mentioned in documentaries about the Depression. 2 assassination attempts were made on McFadden's life. The first was a shooting outside a hotel. He survived. The second was a poisoning at a political banquet. He survived that too. The third time, in 1936, he didn't survive. He died suddenly at another banquet. The official cause was heart failure. He was 60 years old and in good health. No autopsy results were ever made public. The man who spent a decade trying to expose the Federal Reserve died, and the newspapers barely covered it. Charles Lindbergh Sr., the congressman who warned that the Federal Reserve Act would create the most gigantic trust on earth, was destroyed politically when he opposed American entry into World War I. Funded by Federal Reserve inflation, he was labeled a traitor. His printing plates were seized by federal agents. His pamphlets were confiscated. He was effectively silenced. His son would become famous for flying across the Atlantic. His warnings about banking were buried with him. If you're still watching, you understand more about money than most economics professors. Subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep exposing what the financial establishment spent a century hiding. The next video will show you exactly how they plan to erase $38 trillion in debt without paying back a penny. Spoiler, they're going to take it from your savings. The playbook is already running. The language deception proved its value almost immediately. Within 4 years of the Fed's creation, America entered World War I. The war cost over $30 billion, a staggering sum at the time. Before the Fed, financing a war of that scale would have required massive tax increases or explicit borrowing that the public could see and debate. With the Fed, the government could fund the war through currency expansion, print money, buy bonds, monetize the debt. The public didn't vote for the spending. They paid for it through inflation they didn't understand. This was the Bank of England model in action. The same technique that had financed Britain's wars for 2 centuries was now financing American wars. The Fed didn't just enable World War I. It enabled every war since: Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. None of them were funded through direct taxation that would have forced the public to weigh the costs. All of them were funded through debt monetization that hid the true price in rising prices and falling purchasing power. The Fed was designed to fund wars without asking permission. It has never stopped. The Roaring Twenties that followed were the Fed's first experiment in artificial prosperity. Benjamin Strong, the Morgan banker from Jekyll Island who became president of the New York Fed, flooded the economy with easy credit. Stock prices soared. Everyone felt rich. The newspapers called it the new era. Then in 1929, the Fed contracted the money supply. Credit dried up. The bubble popped. Banks failed by the thousands. The Depression lasted 12 years. The same bankers who inflated the bubble bought assets at the bottom. It was the wealth transfer mechanism working exactly as designed. The pattern has repeated ever since. Easy money creates bubbles. Tight money pops them. Each cycle transfers wealth upward. They call it the business cycle, as if it's natural. It's not natural. It's policy. It's the machine running its program. The language tricks didn't stop in 1913. They evolved. Every decade brought new terms designed to hide what was actually happening. Quantitative easing, it sounds technical, scientific, like medicine being administered by experts. What it actually means is printing money to buy the government's debt. They create dollars from nothing, and use them to purchase treasury bonds that nobody else wants. This keeps interest rates artificially low and floods the economy with currency that dilutes your savings. But quantitative easing sounds much better than money printing. Open market operations. It sounds like free trade, fair exchange. What it actually means is the Fed manipulating bond prices to control the entire economy. They buy and sell in quantities so large that no market can resist them. It's not a market when one player can print infinite chips. Monetary policy. It sounds like wise governance, careful management. What it actually means is a small group of unelected bankers deciding how much your money is worth. They meet in secret. They release their minutes with a delay. They cannot be fired. They cannot be audited. They answer to no voter. But it's called policy, so it sounds democratic. Inflation targeting, it sounds precise, responsible. 2% inflation sounds harmless. But 2% per year means your savings lose half their value every 35 years. Over a lifetime, that's deliberate impoverishment. They've convinced you that losing purchasing power is normal, healthy, even. That's the power of language. The deception has reached its final form with the push for central bank digital currency, the CBDC. They're calling it modernization, efficiency, financial inclusion. What it actually means is the elimination of cash, the last form of money that exists outside their control. With a CBDC, every transaction is tracked. Money can be programmed to expire, forcing you to spend. Interest rates can go negative, meaning they can take money directly from your account. It's not a currency, it's a control system. But they'll call it progress. This is the legacy of Jekyll Island. Not just an institution, but a language, a way of describing control as freedom, theft as stability, and slavery as security. The 7 men on that island didn't just design a central bank. They designed a vocabulary that would hide what they were doing from generation after generation. So what do you do with this knowledge? First, you learn to hear what they're actually saying. When the Fed announces a new program with a technical name, translate it. What are they creating? Who gets it first? Who pays for it last? The answers are always the same. They create money. Banks get it first. You pay through inflation. Second, you opt out of the system they designed. They want you to hold dollars in savings accounts, earning 4% while real inflation runs 8%. That's not saving. That's donating to the banks. The only defense is to own things they cannot print. Gold has held value for 5,000 years because no committee can vote it into existence. Land produces real income and cannot be inflated away. Bitcoin was designed specifically to be money that no central authority can manipulate. 21 million coins forever. No Jekyll Island meeting can change that number. Third, you spread the vocabulary. The bankers won in 1913 because the public didn't understand what they were voting for. The words confused them. Federal sounded governmental. Reserve sounded safe. System sounded democratic. Every person who learns the real meaning of these terms is one more person who can see through the next deception. The 7 men who gathered on Jekyll Island in 1910 are all dead. Warburg, Aldrich, Vanderlip, Davison, Strong, Norton, Andrew, all in the ground, but their vocabulary lives on. Every time a Fed chairman speaks in jargon designed to confuse, he's using their playbook. Every time a technical term hides a wealth transfer, their ghost is collecting. You were taught that the Federal Reserve protects you from financial instability. It doesn't. It is the source of financial instability. Every boom and bust since 1913 was caused by the same mechanism. Easy money inflating bubbles, tight money popping them, wealth transferring from the many to the few. They call this the business cycle, as if it's natural, as if it's weather. It's not. It's policy. It's the machine working exactly as designed. The prison they built in 1910 has no visible bars. The chains are made of language. The walls are made of confusion. But once you see it, you can never unsee it. The Federal Reserve is not federal. The reserve doesn't exist. The system serves those who own it, not those who use its currency. Your great-grandparents never understood what happened in 1913. Your grandparents were too busy surviving the Depression and the wars the Fed financed. Your parents were told it was too complicated to understand. But you have access to information they never did. You can read the original documents. You can trace the money. You can learn the real vocabulary. The question is what you're going to do with it. Drop a comment below and tell me. When did you first realize the words didn't match the reality? Was it when you learned the Federal Reserve isn't federal? Was it when you saw bailouts called stimulus? Was it when they told you inflation was transitory while your grocery bill doubled? Tell me your moment. Because that moment of seeing through the language is where freedom begins. The ghost of Jekyll Island is still collecting. The words they chose are still hiding the theft. But now you know the real language. And that's the first step out of the prison they designed.